Hi everyone, this is section 4, um, and we're starting the second chapter now. I don't think I'm going to be able to get through the entire chapter in one video, but I might. There's a possibility. So let's get started here. On another day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before him. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him, to ruin him without any reason." "Skin for skin," Satan replied. "A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. When Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Nahamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. So this is a point that I covered earlier. I sort of touched on this earlier, but Job's faith had nothing to do with what he had. Nothing. And it had nothing to do with his very life. The text would lead us to believe that Job's injuries were rather severe and probably brought him to the brink of death. So these weren't just cuts. These were very serious injuries. He was very sick. And even in that, he maintained his faith. He was clueless as to what was going on. And he, as we're going to see later on in the text, starting in the 3rd chapter, he doubted God in the sense, God must not think too well of me because he allowed all of this to happen. Second thing I want to point out is that we have to remember that pain causes people to inflict pain upon themselves, to find a way to articulate that pain in some way. And that's what we see Job doing when he cut himself, while he was sitting on the ground. What that tells you is that Job was very saddened, and understandably so, by what he had experienced, and he um, felt as though one of the only ways he could really show that was by cutting himself. And perhaps to a degree, um, there was a portion of him that uh, felt some sense of comfort um, uh, in doing that. And then that's one of the things that you'll find with people who who are dealing with some excuse me, some sort of mental illness, is that they engage in self-harm. And while we discourage that, we have to acknowledge the psychology and the reasoning behind it, if we are to in any way mitigate it. So I just wanted to point that out. And also, um, and this is also, I sort of hit on this earlier as well. Um, Election, as Paul uh, would later define it, um, is not limited to the spiritual uh, condition of individuals, whether or not they indeed are people of faith. I think it's also um, uh, relevant to what happens to us in our lives, the things that we endure in our lives. One of the things that I've had to think about and reckon with is the fact that God allowed me to experience the hardship of having divorced parents. And I think to myself, and I say, that really wasn't that really wasn't fair, right? Because that really kind of messed up a lot. Um, and One would argue, on one of my worst days, I would argue that I'm not equipped to deal with all of the fallout that came out of that in many ways I'm still having to deal with to this day, with the dysfunction um, uh, that exists within my family. But Job's story and the theological understanding that we can glean from it would lead me to believe that indeed God specifically chose me to endure this particular hardship and the depression that came along with it, and really the whole nine. And I'm not the only one who has had to you know deal with things as a result of my parents split, and everything else that's been going on with my family. Um, and so you're gonna have your own seasons. You're gonna have your own things that you're gonna have to deal with, and it's not really gonna seem fair. But for whatever reason, God has chosen you. God has um, given you the ability to experience it. And one of the things that we have to recognize, and this is where a lot of, this is where people sort of miss the whole concept of mental health. You have to be present with those who are experiencing a difficulty, who are in the middle of a season of depression, anxiety, whatever it is. Just as Job's friends were, they traveled to him Um, and they weren't just a few blocks away. Um, these people had to travel to him. What does that tell you? It tells you that they cared enough about their friend that they wanted to physically be with him, not send something, uh, in the mail. They didn't have a mail system back then, but you know what I'm getting at. Um, Not, send a message. They wanted to be there with him. And then they didn't even bother to speak because they were so taken aback by his condition. And that was not just and not that just wasn't, outward appearance. They weren't just talking about how he looked. They were talking about how he felt. They understood that just by being with him. They wouldn't have understood that writing a letter or something like that. Um, uh, they had to physically be there with him in order to genuinely be the support that he required in that moment. It's very important. And that's what we have to do. That's really a model for how we should address and interact with people dealing with mental health. And finally, um, pursuant to the last point, we have to acknowledge the emotion that comes with people's experiences. Some people are grieving. Some people are dealing with sickness. People aren't just depressed because they decided to be depressed. There's a reason. And it may not always seem uh, 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 as though it's, it warrants, that sort of emotional investment, the response. But everybody deals with things differently. And for Job, what he had to endure hit him to his heart. He lost his children, for God's sakes. All right, this was no uh, 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 light situation as he perceived it. And anybody you talk to who has depression will tell you the gravity of the hurt that is associated with that is beyond what they're able to articulate. And we have to really humble ourselves and acquire a Christ-like disposition in order to meet people where they are emotionally and recognize that they really are having a difficult time and they deserve nothing more than our empathy and our time to care for them.